All right, welcome, everybody. All right, I'm going to start this now. Whoa. I'm seeing a lot of nice chat going on. Very good. All right, good evening. On behalf of the Hyde Park Historical Society and Chicago Hyde Park Village, I would like to welcome you to the Hyde Park Book Club session on Bette Howland, author of W-3. I'm seeing a lot of new faces here. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes to give you a little background on who we are and why we're here. The Hyde Park Historical Society was founded in 1977 and is located physically, not virtually, in a historic cable car building built in 1893 by the Chicago City Street Railway. In addition to the neighborhood of Hyde Park, as it exists now in Chicago, the Hyde Park Historical Society covers the area originally bounded by Hyde Park Township, or actually most of Chicago's South Side.
Michael,
could I remind everybody who's coming in to please mute themselves? All right, so the area originally bounded by Hyde Park Township, which is most of Chicago's current South Side. The society was founded to record Hyde Park history, preserve selected artifacts and documents of that history for exhibition and research, to promote public interest in Hyde Park and the preservation of its history, and educate and involve local groups in an appreciation and understanding of Hyde Park's heritage.
Right, yeah.
And
Audrey wants to talk to you.
hi.
in 2015, the Hyde Park Historical Society partnered with the Chicago Hyde Park Village to form the Hyde Park Book Club, which is where you're at right now. The book club celebrates all things Hyde Park and Chicago's South Side. That includes history, Hyde Park authors, books about Hyde Park, fiction set in Hyde Park. In other words, the historical and literary wealth of Chicago's South Side. Okay. At this point, I would like to ask for your understanding. Our small book club is new to meetings of this size. As of right now, we have over 60 people online and more joining by the minute. We started meeting locally in person with a group of 15 or less, and more recently transitioned to a Zoom group of around 30. So please excuse any inexperience on our part. We're doing the best we can, but this is all kind of new to us. We are certainly delighted to have you all with us. Please use the chat function to let us know who you are and where you come from, because I see a lot of new people coming in here that are not local to Hyde Park. We will, as this meeting goes on, we will be fielding the discussion through both chat and live discussion once the presentations are complete. But everybody, please mute yourself if you're not actively speaking. For those of you who are unable to attend this live session, we are recording it and we'll post it to our website in the near future. And now I would like to introduce our moderator, Donnie Jeffries. Donnie met Bette years ago when Bette lived in Union Pure, Michigan. And Donnie followed the story of Brigid's rediscovery of Bette's writing. She is responsible for bringing this program to the Hyde Park Book Club.
Okay, can we start the slides?
Yep, doing that right now.
Okay, sorry.
All right. let me go to.
Okay. So welcome everyone to this evening's event. And I first want to introduce Bette Howland's sons, Jacob Howland and Frank Howland, who have joined us this evening. We're delighted for them to be here. Jacob is an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Tulsa in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Frank Howland is the John W. Bachman Edward Jones Professor of Economics and Leadership at Wabash in Crawfordsville, Indiana. And now I'll turn to introduce Brigid Hughes, the publisher. Brigid is the founding editor of A Public Space, which is an independent nonprofit publisher of award-winning literary arts and culture magazine, as well as public books. Under her direction since 2006, the mission has been to seek out overlooked and unclassifiable work and to publish writing from beyond established confines. In 2015, A Public Space published a portfolio of W-3 by Bette Howland. In 2019, A Public Space published Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, followed by W-3 in 2021. Based in Brooklyn, A Public Space Books is a full-fledged publisher partnered with a book distributor that handles sales to stores across the US and Canada. An alumna of Northwestern University, Brigid is long acquainted with Chicago. An introduction to W-3. In 1968, Bette Howland, a divorced single mother of 2 boys and a struggling author, took an overdose of sleeping pills and was admitted to the University of Chicago's psychiatric ward, W-3, the ward. W-3 is a memoir of her experience, originally published in 1974 and newly republished in 2021. Bette went on to become a MacArthur Fellow in 1984 and was a close friend and mentee of Saul Bellow. Her story and published works were largely forgotten until editor Brigid Hughes discovered W-3 in 2015. Here's milestones in Bette Howland's life. In 1955, she earned an AB from the University of Chicago, followed by the 1960s, which marked her early publications. In 1967, she worked on an MFA at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and in 1974 published W-3. Then in 1978 came the publication of Blue in Chicago, followed by a Guggenheim Fellowship the same year. In 1983, she published Things to Come and Go, and in 1984, she was awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant. And then in 1999, Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage was published. And just to put Bette Howland in context in Hyde Park, she was here first in 1953 to 1955 as an undergraduate at the university. First commuting from the west side to the university, but later working as an au pair of sorts in Hyde Park. Then fall of 1968, she was at Billings. In 1968 to 69, she and Frank and Jacob lived at 56 in Dorchester, and Frank and Jacob attended Ray School that spring. From 1969 to 1976, Bette continued to live in Hyde Park in the building, which is now the University Park condominiums in the middle of 55th Street. Bette then later returned to Hyde Park in 1993 to teach at the Committee on Social Thought and continued to do so through 1996. And here are the book covers for you to gaze upon. And at this point, the publishers and booksellers are W-3, the Public Space and Seminary Co-op bookstores here, and the same for Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage. And again, I want to stress that The books are sold to bookstores across the country. Okay.
And just a shameless plug for the Hyde Park Book Club before we open up the discussion.
Yeah. So I'll turn the floor over to Frank Howland, who will start with his remarks.
Okay, thanks very much. I hope everybody can hear me. To join in the sounds from unmuted people, we have our dog who may occasionally make an appearance. So I'm going to spend a few minutes describing my mother's writing career and the themes of her books and stories, and just give a few more words of background. My mother was born into a working class Jewish family on the west side of Chicago in 1937. She was a scholarship student at the University of Chicago, entering the university actually in the fall of 1952. I told you guys 53, but it was the fall of 52 when she was 15, and she graduated just before her 19th birthday. Not surprisingly, my mother loved books and read very widely. She also loved music, art, architecture, and theater. Just a list of some of her favorite authors includes James Fenimore Cooper, Stendhal, Dickens, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Hardy, Stephen Crane, Henry James, Joseph Conrad, D.H. Lawrence, Dreiser, Faulkner, and Primo Levi. She studied biblical literature and read a great deal about the Holocaust. She adored Bach's cello suites and Schubert's piano sonatas, loved the Missa Luba, a Latin mass sung in the convent style, and was a huge fan of Joan Baez and Odetta. She's also a fan of both classical and modern dance, and with her, my brother and I saw the Alvin Ailey dance troupe, Edward Villela, Rudolf Nureyev, Mikhail Baryshnikov. She took us to see all the Charlie Chaplin movies, most of them at the Clark Theater here in Chicago. Other favorites besides Charlie Chaplin were Marlon Brando, Humphrey Bogart, Paul Newman, Clint Eastwood, and later in life, Matt Damon. In England, we saw the Royal Shakespeare Company and Mozart operas. On other trips, we saw Laurence Olivier in Long Day's Journey into Night, hiked the Yorkshire coast, took sailing lessons in East Anglia, and toured the cathedrals in Ely, York, Salisbury, Milan, and Rome. We went to the Uffizi in Florence, the Vatican in Rome, the National Gallery in London, the Metropolitan, and the Frick in New York. Her favorite painting, Bellini's St. Francis in the Wilderness, hangs in the Frick. My mother also loved natural beauty and lived in beautiful places. For example, Peaks Island, Maine, Santa Fe, and Port Townsend, Washington. She loved to walk along the shore of Lake Michigan in every season. I believe she always wanted to write. As mentioned, her first two published stories appeared in 1958 when she was 21. Another one followed in 1962. She studied at the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop from 1965 to 1967, excuse me. And she received a master's degree there, but she was unhappy with the program and with the novel she produced there. In 1969 or 1970, my mother took a job as an editor at the University of Chicago Press. Around the same time, she became a graduate student at the Committee on Social Thought. She was probably still working on W-3 when she started to publish the stories that later went into her second book, Blue in Chicago, which came out in 1978. I should mention that Blue in Chicago, the stories there also appeared in the book Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, which a public space brought out. And that book also confusingly included the story Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, which was published in 1999. Back to Blue in Chicago, 4 of the stories that went into Blue in Chicago appeared in Commentary magazine between 1972 and 1975. The 2 great themes of my mother's stories are the people who live on the margins in Chicago, the poor, the old, and the sick, and her family. An undercurrent running through much of her work is, for want of a better word, the energy, natural and man-made, of Chicago. My mother's family is perhaps the most prominent subject in the 3 books she published during her lifetime. To give just a few examples, The opening title story in Blue in Chicago describes a family wedding. The last story in the collection, How We Got the Woman to Go, describes the death of my great-grandmother, whom Jacob and I remember, who was a prominent character in the first story. In parts of Golden Age, another piece in the book, my mother describes her family both as they are in the early 1970s when she's writing it, and as they were in the 1940s and early 50s. Her third book, Things to Come and Go, begins with a story called Birds of a Feather, which is largely fiction, but still draws on the reservoir of her own family history. The third story in that collection, which is called The Life You Gave Me, is lightly fictionalized, and it describes her parents' relationship with them in the 1970s and early 1980s, by which time they had permanently retired to Florida. You might ask how much of what my mother has to say about her family is fiction. This is what she had to say, and this has been quoted several times elsewhere. When people worry about whether something is fiction or nonfiction, they are worrying about how much invention there is. They should be worrying about how much imagination there is. There is very little invention in Blue in Chicago. There's a lot of imagination. I wasn't around in the 1940s and early 50s, but I can say that the portraits she paints of the family in the 60s and 70s are dead on. She rearranges details, suppresses some things, magnifies others, but she captures the essence of our great aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, and great-grandmother. The second theme in her writing is the poor, the old, and the downtrodden. In public facilities, it's people in Uptown, where Jake and I lived, and I went to fourth grade there. People in Uptown who go to the local public library branch because they have no other place to go. People suffering from age, failure, sickness, and neglect. 26 in California, another story in Blue in Chicago, describes what goes on in the criminal courts. In a criminal courtroom, there are, she says, roughly speaking, only two kinds of people. On the one hand, both the plaintiffs and defendants are almost all Black, and even more overwhelmingly, the bleak, unstylish poor. On the other hand, there's the professional administrative class, almost all white. Golden Age, mentioned before, is a series of vignettes describing the lives of old people, an elderly mother of a professor at the University of Chicago, the old folks at a Golden Diner's lunch where her mother volunteers, and her own grandmother, every one of them struggling to lead a dignified, independent life. Finally, there's the natural environment in the background that somehow multiplies its power in conjunction with the built environment. To illustrate, here's a passage from the story 26 in California, which my mother read to Studs Terkel during a marvelous WFMT interview from 1980. You can still find it. The big flinty block at 26 in California really does seem to stand in the midst of a prairie, open to the elements. The windows look far out over the vast industrial plain of Chicago. It shimmers with power. The mighty haze hurts your eyes. I don't know, maybe it wasn't such a hot idea to build a city on the site. There's too much energy here. Along with the power of construction goes the power of destruction. Tohu and bohu, vacant lots, buildings condemned, neighborhoods decayed. Chicago isn't a city, just the raw materials for a city. The prairie is always reasserting itself, pressing its claims. And now just a few words about other things that my mother wrote. The title piece in the book published last year by Public Space is Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, a long novella originally published in the magazine Tri-Quarterly in 1999. It's a tale of the last days of an ex-lover of the narrator, based on a real-life relationship. The novella represents a significant departure from her earlier work and may well be the best thing she ever wrote. Another notable work that appeared a year earlier, was a long nonfiction article titled Trial about a double murder and subsequent court case that occurred in Union Pier, Michigan, where she lived. My mother also published lots of book reviews, many of them in the Chicago Tribune, and some literary and cultural criticism, including pieces on Genesis, Henry James, Christina Stead, James D. Farrell, and Houdini. that's it for now. Thank you.
So we'll turn to Jacob now for his remarks.
Okay, well, can you hear me?
I believe so.
Okay, good.
Yes, we can.
All right, good. If you ask professors to speak, they will read things. So I'm going to focus on W3. Some months after leaving Ward 3, Betty realized that she had had what is called a nervous breakdown. By then, she writes in her book's last lines, I had moved on into other regions, and the word held no special terrors for me. In other words, it might also be described as a place. What sort of place is W3? Are the emergency room doors, she wonders, the birth canal, the portals of death? When she awakens in the ICU from a condition that wasn't dark, wasn't anything, she's conscious of a briny taste, the flavor of seawater. Her hands, taped to boards, felt like oars. Using the coughing machine was violent activity, the equivalent of swimming a choppy channel. The bed was moored in a room without darkness or daylight. This is the language of myth, of the soul's journey through territories of ultimacy. Crossing the waters of oblivion, she arrives at twilight or dawn, at the edge of the world, a region between life and death. These are not figures of speech, but the actual terms of my mother's experience. At the very center of a book full of mysteries, we come close to the heart of this one. Lying in the dark and listening to a conversation in the next room between Henry, Frankie, Simone, a spirit figure, rookie, crow-like, and claiming intimacy with the Holy Ghost, Betty experiences gorgeous hallucinations. She sees Frankie's face hanging over her, distorted. Other faces swarm around, all seemingly lit from beneath as if by firelight, and I could see their shadows stirring over all the walls. That night, Frankie, too, sees strange dark faces that cast shadows on her ceiling. The simplest explanation, Betty writes, was that I really had been seeing the same things Frankie saw. Whatever that was, some third thing, some objective fact. I'm pretty sure it had something to do with Simone. Maybe those were her spirits? In other words, W3 is a memoir of real experience in which facts, signifying nothing in themselves, are transmuted and made to speak by an imagination that has plumbed the depths and encountered the deepest realities of the spirit, soul, or psyche. For Eun Lee, W3 has the feel of Alice in Wonderland. Indeed, the ward is a wonderland where humans reveal themselves as animals. Trudy cages cigarettes and food. She is a poacher by nature, like a cuckoo. But when confined to isolation, she is like a penguin, alone on some stony island. Betty's mother has a head of white hair that is sleek, striking like an ermine. At a moment of helplessness, she resembles a seal emerging from the salty depths. There was such a sleek, sorrowful sparkle. You can hear the sea in her look. Guz is large, dark, powerful, confused, blood-spattered. Running into him in the hall is like encountering a bear in a forest. Nervous, diminutive Cindy twitches his pink nose like a rabbit. Chattering Henry resembles a grasshopper. Listless Fran is a sloth. Blunt Pearl is a bulldog. Delicate Kim tucks her legs under her like a waiting bird. Weeping Elka leaks mascara like a squid. With her cropped hair and croaking voice, Betty herself is just another strange bird. Rebuking another inmate, she tosses her head like a tethered goat. W3 has things, Betty writes, beyond what is dreamt of in our philosophy. It has its own Caliban. Yvette, a big, wild, volatile woman whose soul was in transition. Her spirit's sleep was ruptured, but in her, it was raised to the umpteenth power. She possessed the power of the general. That was her curious gift. She was a picture of my soul. So was silent, red-eyed Cootie, built like the Minotaur, who miraculously finds her still small voice and her way out of the labyrinth of mental illness after a night of listening to Simone and Frankie and Henry. In fact, All the characters of W-3 are in some way pictures of Betty's soul and of their own. This is the peculiar magic of a writer whose salvation, we feel, depends above all on her powers of observation. Shortly before her suicide attempt, Betty was afraid to leave her apartment. I might have been taking off into the next world, hell, the past, the moon. W-3, where phantoms roam under an enchantment, is all these things, even outer space. Iris's eyes were blank and cloudy like cosmic dust. Zelma's blazed like some cold, undiscovered element. On the ward, women ceased to menstruate. Natural processes were reversed. For our sins, we had been returned. We were as children. Wound backward in time toward primordial chaos, inmates on W-3 were naked, undefended at last to the psychic currents that circulated so freely among us. Like Greeks venturing into Hades, the staff must shield their own vulnerable psyches beneath the business of the real world. Without this armor, they could not have come among us, she writes. Even so, the doctors cannot help imitating the foul language of brash, kind Trudy. At every stage of her journey into the limbo of the ward, who would rather not be in hell, she asks, Betty encounters women with mysterious powers, most of them black, like Simone. In the ICU, where she first hears infernal outcries and agonies, a man burned by chemicals, a girl with an open wound in her stomach, she is cared for by Henrietta, a private nurse who tries earnestly, but comically, to restore her voice, damaged by intubation, through sheer force of will. The wife of a preacher and the daughter of a future mortician. This world and the next, Betty remarks, it was all sewed up. Henrietta is a strong, beautiful woman, her hair clinging to her like an animal's coat. And she seemed to be growing all the while. Still stunned and raw, Betty shrinks like Alice in the presence of this medicine woman. W-3 has something of the ring structure of ancient epic. The first voice Betty hears in the hospital is her mother's, whispering, "You will be reborn." This proves prophetic, although her needy mother, in her attractive, bold checked suit, a hand-me-down from the woman she worked for, has little to do with it. Much more important is her friend's Aunt Rose, who arrives from the ghetto near the end of the book in an ill-fitting suit, also an employer's hand-me-down, draped, shaman-like, in a fur coat of split pelts with hooks like claws. It is Rose who, alone among the characters of W-3, utters Betty's name. All business, Betty's successful friend Jay gives her much the same pep talk at book's end as Henrietta does at its beginning. But it is Gerda who repelled and attracted Betty and whom she understood to the limit, because she was my depression, the bottom of it, crossing the deeps, the rolling dark that still lay ahead of me. It is Gerda who finally cut the cord for both of us. So great was Betty's shock at seeing her emaciated, broken body after she'd jumped out a window. Whatever else it might be for her, W-3 is a womb. Its perilous sweeping waters, a rush of amniotic fluid. In the end, Betty does not die, unhouseled, unanointed, unannealed, no reckoning made, but sent to my account with all my ignorance on my head. She finds some saving knowledge and draws from the common stock of myth and literature to fashion her indigenously American, Chicagoan, working class, and female voice. She would surely agree with Salvador Dali, who said that everything that is not tradition is plagiarism, because only art nourished by the blood of reality can be truly original. W-3 is her unique solution to the problem of the total dissolution of the particular into the general, that is, as she shows, the real meaning of death. That's all I've got.
Thank you so much, Jacob and Frank. And Dottie, thank you so much for organizing this event. Back in 2015, one of the reasons that I picked up that copy of W-3 in the used bookstore was because of the writer's connection to Chicago. So it's just special and meaningful to be here with the Hyde Park Book Club in a neighborhood that shaped so much of Betty's work, and to have a chance to talk with her sons and with people who knew her. It feels somehow appropriate to be meeting Bette Howland, not directly, but through the people who she knew and who were important to her. I know that I have a lot of questions for Jacob and Frank, and I'm sure that everyone else does too. So I thought I might just speak very briefly and share just two passages that were sort of what first connected me to Bette Howland's work, and that are in a sense the reason that we are all here tonight, what led us to want to bring her work back into print. And the first is the passage that when I picked up that copy of W-3 on the $1 cart at the used bookstore, the passage that I opened up to, which for those of you who have read the book, I think you'll recognize is from the opening chapter. She says, "All I knew was this: I couldn't take it anymore. No longer could bear this burden of concealment. Things seemed bad enough without adding extra weight. I wanted to be rid of it all of it. I wanted to abandon all this personal history, its darkness and secrecy, its private grievances, its well-licked sorrows and prides, to thrust it from me like a manhole cover. That's what I had wanted all along. That's what I was trying for when I swallowed those pills, what I had hoped to obliterate. That was my real need. It had at last expressed itself, become all-powerful. Tell people where I am," I whispered, "and ask them what they want me to make for them." I think Jacob at one point has said that about W-3, that with this book, his mother wrote herself out of the grave. And so, and I think something that you'll see a lot in many of the reviews of W-3 is this sort of expectation or desire for the center of the book to be Bette talking about herself, and sort of the surprise at how removed or how little of her there is in the book, and how much of it is her looking at others. And that, I think, was the other thing, sort of the second quality that really drew me to her work. And she sort of captures it in a passage in her story, Blue in Chicago, which Jacob quotes in an essay that he wrote for the portfolio that we did in the magazine. And it's very short, so I'll just read that as well. She's talking about taking the bus to school. And she says, "I always take books with me on buses or trains. I never read them. It seems to me that there is something immoral, because inattentive, about reading when your body is in transit. I should be paying attention instead, but paying attention to what?" And for me, I guess both asking that question and the way she answers it just are of endless fascination to me. And I think sort of every time I open one of her stories or turn to a page in W-3, sort of that's what I'm noticing, and sort of trying to understand her through what she's paying attention to. And with that, maybe Donnie, before we open it up to questions from the audience, maybe I could sort of selfishly ask Frank and
that would be great.
A question, if that would be okay.
Please do. Please do.
I'm curious for both of you reading both W-3 and reading the stories. You know, and there's a letter that she wrote to her editor about W-3 where she was very insistent about that she was writing about facts. And then Frank has the quote about imagination, which I think was from an interview where she was talking about Blue in Chicago. But I'm curious if there's a passage or a moment in W-3 or in her stories where you most recognize her. Does that make sense? Where you say, aha, that's my mother, that's the person I remember? Or is that a hard question?
That's a hard question.
Yeah.
So I'll answer something different. I think
Okay.
that the thing that and I mentioned it before, is that our family is so present in Blue in Chicago. Our grandmother is there and is entirely believable, in W-3. And so it's you know, it's we recognize it. To me, it's a very true picture. Now, I should say that there's also kind of a bit of family myth that's there. So she talks about my grandfather and about how strong he was, and you know, he all the neighbors relied on him to fix things up, and there's a bit of I don't know, exaggeration or just sort of emphasizing this aspect of his character and his life that was also present in the story that my grandparents told about themselves. So it's sort of reinforcing, and you know, also things that we possess. We have photos of our family, and you know, her descriptions of my grandfather's mother, my great grandmother, and of her daughters. You know, there's a passage where she describes them walking along, and something I just read very recently. You know, it comports very well with the photograph, one photograph that I'm remembering. So it's all very true. To me, I should also say, that rereading W-3, it's kind of and trying to discover, and I think I've got a better sense of what it was that she was truly reborn. I mean, she really became, you know, she remained somewhat depressed throughout her life, but she overcame this horrible thing that had happened to her, and she immediately set to work writing wonderful things. I'll stop and let Jacob talk a little.
I mean, it's an interesting question, because I was actually thinking, Brigid, if I could think of anything in her writing that wasn't, you know, like my mother. I mean, because she's and so, you know, you read that passage about, like, what should I pay attention to, and she emphasized in her conversation with us being observant. Okay, in fact, she used to praise both of us for being very observant. You know, I remember I was a little kid, I was like, I'm not that observant, I don't know what you're about. And she would also talk about ardor. I think I mentioned in something I wrote, you know, this was one of her favorite words, you know. And so, but from a very early age, there was a lovely letter in the University of Chicago magazine by the fellow who appears in her book under the name of Jay, and that actually is his name, saying that, you know, when he knew her in college, you know, she wanted to be a Nobel Prize winning writer. I mean, that was like her ambition. My mother was a very thumatic person, you know. She could be angry and she could be highly spirited, but she was also, in a platonic sense, erotic. That is, these two things, as they often are, were sort of combined in a way that would be very difficult to sort of tease them out. I think it takes a lot of spiritedness to sort of battle your way through a childhood with depression age, first generation American immigrants who want nothing more than to succeed as Americans. And that means, you know, have nice things and buy nice stuff and sort of succeed materially. To go to law school for a year, to drop out. I'm sure her parents must have never forgiven her for that. I don't know that, but I'm just inferring it. And to pursue this dream of being a writer. And, you know, the question of, like, how did she get, like, how do you get into W-3 and how do you get out of it? These are sort of two big issues. For me, part of it, I mean, she's tough and she's spirited, but that has to be directed, and it's directed toward this writerly ardor, right? This idea of observing the world, understanding its meaning. And there's a conviction there, which is it's meaningful. And what am I observing? Well, I'm observing, it's sort of cliche, right? But like the terms of endearment, you know, the moral connections between us, between human beings, between her family, between people on the street. You know, Frank was talking about the you know, the poor dispossessed in the library, the down and out and so forth. And that was her subject, right? And that was the subject of her urban writing. And so it's just everywhere in her books. One last thing I can say is that, you know, her books, and I think Ian Lee said this in a previous Zoom conversation that you had, Brigid and Ian and some others, that her writing is very funny. So she's got this kind of wonderful, you know, kind of sort of almost philosophical detachment as she looks at people. Because what is comedy, right? It's this sort of incongruity of human life sort of seen from above, right? But it's also got this tragic depth because you have, you know, people's lives are at stake and they're struggling and they're striving. So she manages to put these two things together in really fine and surprising ways. So I'm not answering your question because there's no single thing I can point to, you know, that sort of really says, oh, that's my mother. She's everywhere and nowhere.
Yeah. Dottie, do you want to see if other people? I don't want to take up all of the space with my questions, but
I think we can open the
Okay.
floor now to questions. And Francis, why don't you go ahead, Fran? Why don't you go ahead? Fran, can you unmute, Fran?
Yes, I'm unmuted. Can you
Okay,
hear me?
yes, now you're unmuted.
I'm a product of the 1950s University of Chicago College. I came in 1955 after 2 years at the University of Michigan, and I lived in a dormitory for a year, and I knew a lot of people who had a lot of interest in the way the mind works, shall we say. And they were all in one level of counseling or another, and we spent a lot of hours talking about Freud and all that. Freud is the thing to talk about. And I kept track of some of the kids that I was in school with, but I also am very interested in what became of them. I've lost track of them, but I want to remember one statement from that wonderful book, which is about the most readable book I've read in a long time. And the author says, nobody believes they belong here. They don't think they belong in this place. In other words, in W3. I remember they're saying that, and I wondered a bit about that because she obviously was tremendously invested, and she was reflecting a need to be there as well as the other people. Did you hear me pretty well?
Yes,
I don't
Fran,
know
we
if you
heard
heard.
you.
Okay, yeah, that's
Fran,
fine.
we
but
heard
if-
you. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I just say that the College of the University of Chicago in the 1950s was rather interesting. One of their favorite characters was called Aristotle Shorts, of all people. Aristotle Shorts was a well-known individual, hypothetical, but it was an interesting time to be here.
We have a question in the chat. So this person asks, I'm afraid I haven't had time to fully digest W3. Aside from Ms. Howland's sensitive observations of the human condition she found in W3, was it life affirming in a direct way for her personally? Did she suffer from depression at all tied to the breakdown?
Frank, what do you think?
Why are you asking such tough questions? I think, I mean, for the first part, she was very observant, and I, you know, it's amazing to think that she was able to take this in, that she was able to come up with all these wonderful character sketches of the people there.
Beautiful.
And, you know, she was able, I mean, I think she thought a great deal about it afterwards, after her experience. But she was able to retain this. So I think there's something there, sort of you know, somehow she was able to take that experience. It became life affirming because she was able to take her memory of it and use that to mine it. You know, and I think Jake is very right that she's using, as she would have put, a lot of imagination and drawing on things which I don't even know that she had retained, you know, possibly from a University of Chicago experience to craft that book. You know, she was, like I said, she still suffered from depression afterwards. But you know, I think it's the breakdown was a very sharp thing, and I think that the underlying depression was there through most of her life, but she had managed to fend the really evil, or the really bad stuff, you know, in the fall of 1968.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say that what struck me about her life is that at such a young age, she had already gone to the University of Chicago and had become a parent. I think both of you were born by the time she was 22.
Yes.
Is that right? So it just, I mean, it was a lot of living. When I think of myself at 22, you know.
Yeah, you know.
Michael?
Yeah, I would just like to say something, and this is truly a literary comment, or at least an observation from reading W-3, is that there's some undefinable point in the middle of that book where she stops making superficial observations about the people in the ward and starts truly understanding them and relating them to herself. And I can't point out exactly where that point in the book was, but I think that was a defining moment for her when she, and maybe as a writer, where she understood what she had been through and was seeing these people not as caricatures or characters, but as people that related to her directly. And that is purely an observation on my part and not a question or anything else.
If I could interject, I worked in the psychiatry department at the University of Chicago in the middle 60s, but in outpatient psychiatry, probably overlapped the period that she may have been an inpatient, so I did not know her. But I do know that many patients at that time stayed in as inpatients much, much longer than they do now. Oftentimes for the standard, what used to be the standard of 120 days, which is almost unthinkable in today's economics of inpatient hospitalization. But I wonder if this also, presuming that she was there for some weeks, if this gave her an opportunity to to exercise her perceptions and to learn more in relationship to what was just said, that her perceptions changed and she began to try to understand and know better some of the fellow patients, and then to write about them may have been related to the fact that she was, I mean, this is all speculative, but the fact that she was there long enough to be able to do that.
I'd like to comment on just a couple of these things. So we had the question from Jean Jenkins, and I see that you followed up, Jean, also about the treatment provided by the staff. I do think she was in for at least 2 months and maybe 3. I think that there's a part in her book where she basically makes it clear, I think, that getting better was being treated with drugs so that your anxieties were reduced, getting fattened up, right? Figuring out how to sleep, And then time goes by and you get out, or you don't if you're one of the sort of perennial people who sort of go back over and over again. But as far as, I think it's an interesting observation, going back to the point about maybe her starting to see people sort of in a more three-dimensional way. It's very interesting because if you look at the doctors, for example, from the very beginning, they're sort of comic characters. So, you know, she gets there, and this again goes to sort of what I was saying in my remarks. Let's say she's on the sort of the first circle, right, of Dante's Hell or something, right? And she's met by, you know, this strong nurse with forearms that you could cut bread on and stuff like this, you know, who yells at her, and you know, and then these sort of four doctors come in. And by the way, all these doctors have names like Joy and Wax and, you know, Good Night, you know, Buonasera or whatever it is, you know, actually that's Italian, I think. But anyway, so they sort of have these character names, and they're almost like this, a sort of comic version of the panel of judges who meet you in Hades in Plato's Myth of Ur or something like this, you know. But the patients are the ones who acquire a more dimensionality at some point. And I do think it sort of takes her a while to get used to that. I don't think it was life affirming, except in the sense that she did put it behind her. That is to say, I think Frank's right. I think she suffered from depression, but it was very clear after her stay in that hospital that she was never going to try to commit suicide again. That was certain. She put that behind her, you know, so. We have other questions?
Other questions or?
I have another one. At what stage in her life did she meet Saul Bellow?
Early 60s.
It was the 60s.
Yeah, I was in a conference in Staten Island, I think, in 62. Maybe Brigid remembers it, something like that. It was very early.
Yeah, she went to a writing conference at Wagner College, I think, on Staten Island. And I think it was 60.
Yeah.
I
want to say even before that, but yes.
60.
Yeah, well, Bellow was associated in a way with the Committee on Social Thought. And I also knew another professor from there who happened to live across the street from us on Dorchester, is Eugene Genlin. And he taught there for a long time. He was in the SSA, not SSA, but the Social Thought Committee for a long time. But it was an interesting group of people, and they were free thinkers, let's put it that way. And good writers, very, very smart people.
Yeah, and I would also just like to add, so for example, we have a file here of some of her papers from the committee. Not all of them by any means, but you know, there's one on Plato's Symposium. There's one, you know, there are papers on Dostoevsky. There are papers on all kinds of things.
That she wrote for the Committee on Social Thought?
Yes.
Oh, my goodness.
Right. And see,
that's interesting.
I think this is really important because I tried to bring out in my remarks on W-3 the way that her studies of the tradition kind of, you know, and I'm talking about Homer and Dante and obviously Lewis Carroll, right? But also Dostoevsky comes up and he's significant, and Shakespeare, right? And more, I'm sure, if we look. In Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, she's doing something extremely interesting because she's got biblical stuff, she's got literary stuff. And so she has this from a very early age, well, and also continuing, you know, through the 60s, she has this kind of reservoir of literary and mythical and religious imagination, right, to draw on. And she doesn't make heavy weather of it. That's what's beautiful, right? In other words, you can sort of see, you know, you wouldn't want to try to say like, you know, like I suggested, like, you know, her books is sort of got this ring structure, and it's so, you know, but it's her own ability to take these sort of bits and things and to shape them into a way, as I was suggesting in W-3, you have these sort of shamanic, you know, African-American strong characters and stuff like this. I mean, this is what I think great writers do. And I think that all of the really great writers are really well schooled in their craft. You know, they have read the great writers themselves. And she was certainly one of them.
Oh, sure.
Okay, we have another question in the chat. Was this considered an expose on institutions as well as insights to humanizing patients at the time?
And well, it's certainly not like wit, you know. Wit actually is, that's a really fantastic piece of work, but that was grabbed onto, right, by the sort of patients' rights and expose folk. I don't think, I mean, maybe Frank, you can speak to this. I don't see in the reviews of W3 any of that or much of that.
I don't think so. Doesn't she mention them wanting to go to see Tittycut Follies or something like that in the book?
Yeah, Zelma wants to go.
I think that there was enough already out there that it wasn't perceived that way. That's my impression. That's just my memory. That's my 45-year-old memory of this.
I see there's a question. Would you two speak to what your mother was like while this book was being written and published? That's one for you, Frank.
Okay. I have a memory for a time she lived in New York, and this is in the early 70s. And I think it was definitely the 70s. I think she was putting together the book, and she was typing in extremely neat typing. And I should say that the process my mother used was writing in longhand over and over again, and then she would type stuff out. She typed very, very rapidly, and then she'd have all this stuff X'd out, and then she'd write stuff on it. And I was really impressed by the fact that this was like so neat and clean. It was a notebook, and it had binder and a hole punch and everything. And I think that this was headed on its way to the publisher. She was putting it to final form, and so she seemed more organized. That's my memory at that time. She was very she was very organized in the sense that she would get up and she'd work. And then from the beginning of the day, she'd work, and then she would knock off in the afternoon and she'd read. But there were papers everywhere, and she really liked sticky notes, and she had sticky notes with things. I guess that's what I got for you right now.
We have a letter that she wrote me, and she would write on anything. Okay, so this letter is like, it's like this big, and it's on super fine, almost tissue paper. Right? She would, and if you look at her manuscripts, almost invariably there's something on the other side. That is to say, there's some version maybe of some other manuscript that she had crossed out or whatever. And so, paper was sort of at a premium, but she had stuff all over the place, just papers everywhere. And of course, books, because she was always reading. So.
We have a question from Carrie Goulis. If anyone in the group tonight knew Bette personally from her years in Hyde Park, and perhaps has memories to share of her. So to that, Ruth Knack?
Yes, yeah. I did. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I knew Bette off and on over a few years, many years. And I was just checking in W3 to find the part that I was in. Speaking of knowing somebody, I came to visit her with another woman who was a classmate of mine, because I was in graduate school. We both were. And it's toward the end of the book. We're presented as kind of Miss Normal and her friend Miss Normal. And I've always wondered about it. We were not bad, but we also had no nickname, nothing like the other people, very much different. And so we were kind of stuck in there. And I've never really known why, because she didn't say. And I wonder if either Frank or Jacob would know or have thought about it. She doesn't give names, but I know. And she doesn't, although we're both kind of ideal characters, and I don't think that applies so much to me, but there I was.
Mm. You know, that's an interesting part, because, so that's very interesting, Ruth. I'm pleased that you outed yourself.
I have.
And you know, because the two of you come in, and I remember is either you or the other, right? You know, sort of freckles on the nose, and you kind of, you know, sunburn, and you're all.
That's right.
She
Blue-eyed. Oh, I have blue eyes, but I don't know about the other one.
and she was very pleased with her friends, right? Because she was proud of you, because this was like her world, right? It's like, here are my friends, right? And then, you know, there's this weird scene, right? Because like she's talking to you in the room, and the nurse keeps coming and saying,
Yes.
time to eat, you know, and she doesn't want to go eat, because when you go to those tables and everyone's sitting there and they're just kind of drugged, and they're just sitting there at their
That's right.
you know, white gluey food, and it looks horrible and so forth. And then somebody says, and you know, when you're leaving, like, it's too bad you lost your sense of humor about this place. And she just feels, I mean, the whole point of the scene is this contrast between who she was, right? Because like, you're her friends, and she identifies with you, and you're graduate students and all this, and then where she was, right? And this was fairly early on, I guess, when she was there. I believe that's right, even though it's toward the ends of the book. And she's just kind of this sort of, you know, being jerked into this, like, because again, she's always sort of standing between two worlds, right? She's always sort of, and then she realized, like, no, I'm one of those guys at the table with the gluey food and I, you know, and she had her hair cut and all this. So it's a very interesting scene, though. Yeah.
Ruth, where did you first meet Bette?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think I met her through a mutual friend, but I'm not sure. I did want to add something else about it quickly. There was somebody else in W-3 who was very, very different from the people that she's describing. And that was an English professor, a much loved English professor who had a drinking problem. Right. He was there, I think, just for a brief time. And Bette doesn't go into much detail about him, but I also have wondered why she didn't, or if either Frank or Jacob know. I'd be curious. I don't want to say the name because it seems unfair, but people would know who have read it and who were at the U of C in English.
Pat Hughes here. Oh, she appears at one point to have developed a writer's block. I wonder, do you know what caused it? Did it upset her? And what, if any, attempts she made to overcome it?
You want to take this, Frank?
Sorry about my dog. Well, this speculation, which I think there's some truth to, that, you know, when she won the MacArthur Award, she felt that she had to live up to that. She spent an awful long time working on something that never appeared, which was her father had a cousin who wrote memoirs of his kind of crazy life. He was born in either Russia or Poland, or he lived in Germany. He lived for a time, I think, with my great-grandparents when they were in Palestine. And this is cousin Herman. And he ended up, he was involved in the Mexican Revolution and in other escapades. He had a very interesting life up until about the age of 35 or so. Came to America and then lived a very boring life. And she met him in the 70s, I think. And he wrote memoirs, and there's just sort of one crazy fact after another. And she spent a lot of time trying to write. She thought this was terrific material, and she spent a lot of time trying to write to make sense of this and to this is it was something very different from and I think that she felt that I believe she's spent a great deal of time on this, and that she never really figured out how to do it. We do have I have a handwritten, it's like what Jake was describing. It's like a tablet used for drawing, and it's got about 80 pages, and she wrote on both sides of this in longhand. She wrote out the story as she had it at that time, and then we also have some typescripts. So there may be something there. We haven't really read through it, but I know that she never she was a perfectionist and never really came to something. She didn't stop writing. I mean, and she kept on. She wrote. She wrote literary criticism, as I mentioned. She was fascinated with Houdini. And she, in the late 1990s, I think she published 2 really interesting pieces. So, and her work stops, I think, around 2005. So that's,
I want to add to that too, and this is something that I've only thought about recently. In the middle of W3, or so, well, I don't know if it's the middle, but in W3, she mentions that before she went to the hospital, or maybe it was some years before, she had what she called brain flu. Okay. And she says, maybe this is what the Russians are talking about when they talk about brain fever, but she describes it as like a caterpillar in her head that shrinks when you touch it. This is an interesting image, incidentally, because it goes back to this sort of a caterpillar can turn into a butterfly, right? But I want to focus on so there's this idea of possible rebirth or something. But more important though, just taking the image, my wife found some letters recently, or she was actually looking today at a notepad in which Bette had been writing. I think it was in the early 90s, or maybe even the late 80s, about physiological symptoms that she had. Everybody should know. Okay, so she was diagnosed with MS at the age of 75, which is extremely late. And the doctor who diagnosed her discovered that she probably had her first symptoms when she was in her 20s. Her left arm was paralyzed and she was put in the hospital, but nobody knew what was going on then. So by the time, like within the last 15 years of her life, at least, given this notebook, the last 15 years of her literary output, she was already experiencing these physiological symptoms. So in this notebook, she writes, I felt like somebody was like pulling my legs and yanking down my legs, and this kind of, and she talks about being more alarmed, not by the symptoms, but by the fact that these strange things were going on. And I mention it because I think she was probably contending with some illness, okay, from MS already during this period of her life, and maybe intermittently through her life, that might have also sort of confused her, and made things more difficult. I must say, though, that after she won the MacArthur, there probably are half a dozen things. Like she was writing a book called Jacob, a Life. She was writing, she'll list novels that she's working on, some of which I've never seen. I mean, we don't know whatever happened to these, but it seemed like she dispersed herself into a bunch of projects. Now, that said, I think W3 is a fantastic book. I think, and also Blue in Chicago and Things to Come and Go, but it's possible that Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage is their sort of really greatest work, and sort of most innovative. And she did produce that in the late 90s. So I don't know if that helps.
Okay.
We have a question in the chat for Brigid. Brigid, at what point did you move from simply appreciating W3 for the first time to realizing you wanted to publish it with a public space?
I think pretty immediately. The first thing was to try to, after finding W3, was to try to find Bette Howland, and that took a little bit of time. And then led us to Jacob, which led us to some of her unpublished work, and we did a portfolio in the magazine. And I think we knew pretty right away that we wanted to find a way to get those books back into print. And as we've done most good things at a public space, we sort of announced we were going to do it, and then we had to figure out how we were going to launch a book imprint. But it's been a real thrill.
I just want to add very quickly that I'm immensely grateful to Brigid. I'm just this is just such a marvelous thing that has happened for my mother and for her sons.
And I mean, for a whole generation of readers who were, discovering and reading this for the first time, and shaping their work to come.
And it's a remarkable accomplishment in these days to become a publisher. And I laud you on your work.
What he said.
We were incredibly lucky that Brigid picked up that book.
Yes.
That she in particular, with all of her skills and abilities and connections and vision, picked up that book, which, by the way, if I understand correctly, Brigid thought the cover looked kind of cool, so she just opened it up. So very important that they're coming.
Who knew? I like the cover.
Cover. He liked the cover.
I just
Well,
want
I would also,
go ahead.
well, I would like to say at this point that we at the Hyde Park Book Club and the Hyde Park Historical Society in Chicago Hyde Park Village are really very proud to have been able to host this event, to tell this incredible story and to really claim Bette as a Hyde Parker, and just to enjoy this moment. And back to what Brigid was saying about the cover, what I was so impressed by, because I have one of the original editions, and it's very understated, but at the beginning of every chapter is a beautifully done initial first letter of the paragraph. And it's a small thing, but it's something a great deal of thought must have gone into. So just a comment on my part. Back to the rest of it.
Any other questions?
Do you want to say? Yeah. My wife has something to say.
Okay, great.
Hey, everybody. So I've known Bette I knew Bette through her son, my husband, Frank, for many years. And one thing that I note about her work is that I read it many years ago when I met Frank, and then I've been rereading it recently. And her words do not feel dated, and her work improves on rereading. So those are my couple of observations.
Yeah, that really strikes me that it doesn't, how resonant it is today, given how long ago it was written.
I want to say that in a file that Ruth Knack loaned to me, I found information about 2 different Centennial conferences for James Farrell, for the writer James G. Farrell. And I believe that at least one of them, Bette was the only female panelist for the conference. And she was certainly recognized for her the regard in which she held Farrell.
Yeah, it was, we were in New York, and my mother was taking Frank and me to meet James G. Farrell, and we got to his apartment building, and the doorman told us that he had died. He had just died.
Oh my gosh.
So we ended up attending the funeral of James T. Farrell. And I guess it was Eugene McCarthy, right, Frank, who was at the funeral? think that's right.
I recall.
Yeah. But anyway, a number of people came to Farrell's funeral, and we have quite a few letters from Farrell to Bette. She has letters from all sorts of writers. It's actually funny because, you know, we'll look through the file and find a letter and say, oh, who is this, you know, and then you look up, you know, I can't remember, I think it was Eleanor Bergstein. I think that's her name. Anyway, we look her up and, oh, she's the one who wrote Dirty Dancing, you know, and so she knew quite a few people, and my wife, you know, she's been reading these letters. And she says, these people all write so well. You know? Yeah, they're writers.
Yes, good writers.
Yeah.
My mother went to a conference in Paris on James T. Farrell, and she took my oldest daughter, with her. So
yeah,
that was fun, and which is at that point that was a good thing that Sarah was there, because Sarah was able to help her figure out the Paris subway system and other things. So.
Right.
I just want to comment that I met Bette in Union Pier, Michigan, in the company of Ruth Knack, and one of the things that always struck me was the fondness she had for her grandchildren, and she was, she just would get, illuminated talking about them, and it was wonderful to see.
Our mother also, she had this fiction that, Jake and I were perfect children, that we never fought. And that was utter nonsense. We fought all the time.
Could you talk a little bit, or do you know, she left Chicago shortly, a few years after sort of the events of W-3, and never really lived there again. Do you sort of know kind of why she left? Did she ever think about coming back? I know she came back to teach for a little bit, but she really left and lived in places that were very much not Chicago.
Yeah, she lived in out of the way places, Peaks Island, Maine. She lived in New Mexico. She loved New Mexico. She lived in rural Pennsylvania. She moved, and she lived in Michigan near the lake. She lived in a Quonset hut. She lived on Frank and Liz's family had a farm, and she lived in the farmhouse for a number of years. She moved a lot, and she was pretty portable. She didn't have a lot of stuff. And she would sort of make her nest everywhere she moved. She loved to cook, by the way, and cook yogurt and all this kind of stuff. And, was like super fit, would always do yoga and swimming and all these things. And it's strange. I feel a little uncertain sort of making connections, because I don't know. I mean, I'm just sort of guessing, but people have pointed out, like in W-3, she's sort of absent. I mean, she's observing, and she's kind of, and I just don't, I'm not sure she felt completely settled anywhere. There wasn't any place that she said, this is my home. I mean, certainly wasn't going to be one of those people who just lived in one place. But why she left Chicago? I mean, all I can say is it was a tough city. But on the other hand, she was adapted to it. I mean, she was a Chicagoan from an early age. She knew the thing. So I don't know. Frank, do you have any ideas about this?
I'll just repeat that she really liked beautiful places. so she very much enjoyed living in Maine and in Peaks Island, and she lived Port Townsend, which is out west of Seattle. There was definitely an attraction. I think she most liked Lake Michigan. She really enjoyed just walking along the beach every part of the year. She loved walking on the beach around Peaks Island and Maine. She could walk around the whole island. I don't know, maybe she felt that she had what she needed from the city. So I'm just not sure. I don't know the answer to that. She never addressed that. And she did live brief. I mean, she lived briefly in Chicago when she taught at the Committee on Social Thought for about 3 years, and then she left. She may have even moved up there before she finished teaching in Chicago. So
yeah.
So it didn't hold that attraction for her anymore.
Yeah, she was always an outsider in some sense. I mean, even obviously, sort of the question of what her place is comes up all the time. Like in Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, you know, she just says to the main character, you know, what am I to you? You know, it's interesting.
But she had no trouble making friends. I'm sorry, not making new friends when she would move to a place. Sorry.
No, I would just like to ask Carrie Gullis at this point if she has any additional questions she would like to ask. Of course, Carrie is the author of a really wonderful. Yeah, I'm sorry, Carrie. Go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't realize. I think I asked Jacob and Frank this already, but I'm going to ask you again just in case. I think because I'm the mother of sons as well, when I was reading your mother's work, I was just desperate for details of you and how she felt as a mother. And I just kind of, there's this wonderful and tragic moment in W3 where you come to visit and you're looking up at the windows and she's waiting and you can't see her. And it especially if you have young children, it just completely breaks your heart. And I just wondered, like, why didn't she write more? I wanted to see you guys grow up. I wanted to see you as adults. I wanted her to see you, you know?
We're boring.
Yeah, I don't know if we're that wonderful material, you know, so.
She likes to boast. She likes to boast about us a little bit. So. Yeah, I should mention, just a personal detail. I have absolutely no memory of that period when she was in W3. You know, what she says is you know, completely believable. I'm sure it's 100% accurate about us. But I can remember the Chicago Convention in 1968. I can remember this detail of her father being stabbed in the back while he was walking along the street by some random idiot, and then he just sort of walked home. He had a fairly fleshy back, and then I can remember being in Miami Beach, Florida, which is where my grandparents lived, and I can remember the school we went to there, and then suddenly we're back and we're going to Ray School, and I remember that part, but absolutely nothing about my mother's illness.
Yeah, it's the same with me. It's a very strange thing. Frank and I have tried to piece together things, and you know, they say that trauma, you know, one of the ways you deal with it is just you just wipe it clean. You know, it's like eating low, it's gone, and it's just a hole. I mean, I have the same memories. I remember the school we were at in Miami while my mother was up in Chicago at Billings Hospital. But zero memory of those months. Nothing. You know.
Thank you.
I will say she writes about you quite a bit in her letters. In some of the letters to Saul Bellow, you're mentioned quite frequently.
She was very proud of us, and yeah. I mean, and she talked, we had, as adults, you know, we spent a lot of time talking to her, and she would talk to Jake about philosophy and literary things, so, you know, we had a strong relationship with our entire adult lives. So, and also, by the way, she didn't, another anecdote. Okay, she certainly didn't believe in sidelining children.
Yeah.
And that extended to, she didn't believe that you needed to lose to children in games. I remember one day she taught us how to play poker, and my grandparents arrived in the apartment. This is in Uptown, just at the moment when I burst into tears because my brother had just bluffed me out of my little hoard of pennies or whatever. And my grandparents, we were sort of appalled at this kind of thing, but I think she was proud that she taught her son. And I remember going to, and it was in the early 70s, going to a seminar in the Community and Social Thought. She took us along, and we got to see Saul Bellow and her and other people discussing, I don't know what, I can't remember, but I thought it was terrific, just absolutely terrific. So I don't know why, Saul was a friend, so I guess he let these 13-year-olds in, but what the heck, it was amazing.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that. And I've been bluffing ever since then, so.
Damn right.
All right, well, do we have any other questions? I have a couple of announcements to make. We've got some interesting book clubs coming up, and I'm gonna just pull them up right now. Monday, March 15th, which is 4 weeks from today, we have a very interesting young 28-year-old author, Gabriel Bump, will join us. He's the 2020 winner of the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence in Fiction by African American Authors. The title of his book is Everywhere You Don't Belong. So he will be joining us on March 15th. And then on Monday, April 19th, we will have a return visit by Joseph Gustatus, who will join us for a discussion on it will be published in early March, Chicago in 50 Objects. Joseph has previously published a book on the year of 1893 and what it meant to Chicago, and he's always come up with some very interesting things. So those are the upcoming meetings for the Hyde Park Book Club. I want to thank everybody tonight. This has been an amazing event. Brigid, we just so appreciated your what you've done here. I personally felt so much interest reading these books, and based upon our participation tonight, so have a lot of other people. So anyway, thank you, Frank and Jacob, for joining us. Thank you, Dottie, for putting this all together. It's been a wonderful evening. And we don't even have to look out the windows, which here in Chicago, we're having a snowstorm, windstorm, ice storm. It's not even fit to go outside. So this has been such a warm and cozy evening that we all appreciate it. So
And if you
thank you
just
all.
one last announcement, if you haven't had a chance to sign in the chat where you're from, that would be great. We're interested to know where everybody came from tonight.
Exactly, because we've had so many new faces tonight, and that's been so pleasurable. So I'm going to leave the window open for a little while longer so people can register on the chat. But again, thank you all for joining us, and good evening.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bridget. Thanks.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Jacob and
Thank you.
Frank.
Thank you.
It was excellent, yeah.
Oh,
There you go.
okay, there we go.
Okay.
Mendocino.
Perth, Australia. Whoa.
Whoa, whoa.
Neat.
Francie, so good to see you again. It's been a while.
And Catherine Howland, it was great to have you here.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
Okay.
All right.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Good night. Thank you for joining
Good
us.
night.
I'm getting ready to shut it down.
Yep.
Okay.
File.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night, Francie. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.